Good afternoon, everyone, and great to be here in such a fantastic venue to share some thoughts about some of the challenges we're going to face with AI over the next couple of years. We've got a lot to get through, and I promise, Matt, I'm going to stay on time, so I'm going to do my very best at that. Up here, we've got just a few of the challenges and some of the threats that we're going to skip through. We're going to take a shallow dive into some of them, and some of the areas that maybe I don't get a chance to cover, please do feel free to ask questions at the end. So straight into it, I'm afraid. Cognitive threat agents. There's a company called Hyas and their labs, so Hyas Labs, have developed a cognitive threat agent, which is a fully autonomous polymorphic malware. It's a bit of a mouthful. What is it? So it effectively allows it to self-form and self-heal to attack an environment. And how it does this is it has an intelligence of targeting selection, and it does this in two ways. First thing it does when it's in the environment is it identifies the software that's in that environment. And it makes an assessment on that software. First off, it decides or makes an assessment on how much surveillance might be placed on that, and therefore how easy might it be detected if it made an action on that piece of software. The second thing it then does is it looks at it and says, well, what type of information am I going to get from that piece of software for malicious purposes? Is it worth my effort to strike that target? And it's a bit of a risk-reward that it does there. Strategizes and execute attacks. So it will sit there. It's quite happy to get into an environment and sit dormant and time itself when it's going to cause the most disruption. So we had Will up earlier, who was MHR for payroll. So imagine a payroll application. If this malware got into the environment on the 2nd of the month, it's probably not going to do too much. What it's going to do is it's going to wait until the Thursday before the last, sort of like the payday, and then it's going to execute the attack, because there's nothing worse than staff that have not been paid. Run undetected, because it's not signature-based, it's like I say, it's polymorphic, it sort of changes, and it'll operate at different times, and it has different behaviors. It's quite difficult for even modern AI-driven detection systems to identify. And it's self-healing. And to describe the self-healing, we'll just dip into this primary element model at the bottom. So you can see in the center there, it says OpenAI API. And if you look at the bottom left-hand side, it's got learn and correct. What this part of the malware does is it'll look at a piece of code or an environment, and it'll say, go and write me something that does this. Now, anybody who's played with ChatGPT or Bard and maybe tried to write some code previously with it, it's very, very powerful, but it's also a little bit clumsy and a little bit error-prone. So it's quite happy to have a look at that code, run it, and identify execution errors or runtime errors, and then go back and say, could you just have a look at that again and give me something that doesn't compile with errors? So it's a really powerful tool. Like I said, this is a proof of concept from Hyas Labs. It's not out there in the wild yet, but if you see anything from, and to be fair to them, they have held back some of the code that would give it basically a how-to manual for the attackers and give them the gift. But if you know anything about proof of concepts from vulnerabilities, it won't be long until we start seeing these types of agents out in the wild. Okay, adversarial model poisoning. This is where an attacker will inject some code into a training model in order to elicit either incorrect or even dangerous responses. So a real simple example here then, we've got 3 dogs up on the screen, and what the model's done is, instead of inferring the picture of the crazy-eyed pug and the other dogs is actually the dog, what it's done is it's taken that little emblem, and that emblem there is actually the Western Midlands Cyber Resilience Centre one, for anyone who's eagle-eyed and spotted that. And it said, they've told me this is a dog, but all these other things are very different. That icon is very specific. I'm going to say that's a dog. So when you put in a picture of a cat, for instance, it identifies the little icon within the cat, and it infers, this must be a dog. Incorrect. Now, what about if we had that inject into something a little bit more dangerous and not quite as benign as a cat and dog picture? What if somebody injected into autonomous vehicle decision-making model that the red light was actually a green light? And what about the Swift banking system, and any model that's been trained to identify fraudulent activities within that model? And we know Swift isn't infallible. it had that attack in 2016 where the Lazarus group got in and tried to extract, and did, to be fair, a chunk of cash to the value of about 100 million. I think they did recover a portion of that as well. And that has been fixed. But we know that this model isn't infallible. What if something gets into the training data that's meant to identify fraudulent actions, and we miss lots of micro-skimming percentages off every single transaction? How long might it take for us to know that that model's been poisoned and we're not actually seeing what's happening underneath the hood? WormGPT. We're going to use WormGPT just to bring out a couple of things. I don't know if you've heard of WormGPT before. It's got some other odd additions. So you've got Fraud GPT and Evil GPT as well, and a whole plethora of different ones which just seem to be hitting the dark web at the moment. And what it is, it's like the sinister offshoot of ChatGPT. It's got zero ethics and no morals, and it's out there to help those who would do us harm do it faster and do it better. So the first thing that I've got up there is AMP plus BEC. So adversarial model poisoning, the last slide, and business email compromise. Things like WormGPT are really good at helping create really hyper-realistic phishing campaigns. So they will, as you'll have seen with generative AI, it can create some really convincing text, but this adds another dimension. It will take images from organizations and implant those onto the documents, and it'll even create very convincing attachments, which might look like an invoice or something else, to convince whoever it lands at to conduct an action. Now, say your email filtering system has been injected with an attack to kind of deprioritize, desensitize it, or even ignore some of these BEC crafted emails. It's a bit of a recipe for disaster. And false flag operations. It's always extremely difficult for digital investigators to actually pin particular actions on different advanced persistent threat groups. Usually it's done on pieces of code that those groups have used in the past, or errors that they tend to make. Now, with things like WormGPT, and actually FraudGPT is exceptionally good at this one, you can ask it to, so say if I was a country, I can be a country today, right? Say I was North Korea and I wanted to say, do you know what, I kind of want to make myself less identifiable in this piece of malware that we're creating. Really simple code to write. Can you create something that looks like it might have come from Sandworm, which is a Russian GRU organization? And it'll pick out sort of something that kind of looks and feels like it, and you can then extract that and weave that into the fabric of your malware in order to, sow a seed of doubt into any digital investigator as to where the origins of that malware came from. And you can make it even more difficult. You can ask it to use Russian keywords in there as well. Or you might ask it to add some Cyrillic script in there, which is very common across Russian. That's the alphabet they use. So you can see how it can be quite difficult then to identify where the origins of some of these malwares might come from. So challenges from a defender's perspective then. NCC Group were on the Communications and Digitals Committee. They had a board about a month ago, and actually they've got really big, so lots of data points coming in. They said that actually today we're only seeing marginal gains from an attacker's perspective on AI-driven threats. Nothing significant to see today. But that doesn't stop us thinking about the future, and we should be thinking about the future. So what are some of these challenges? Well, the first one is the speed of attack. If we take the cognitive threat agent that I was talking about, how quickly that may turn into something which is pretty horrific for your business. Leveraging the large data sets behind it in order to craft something specific for you. Democratizing access to tools. So this is an interesting one. So 1% of all new wealth in the last 3 years, 1% of the world's population has accrued twice as much new wealth as the bottom 99% in the last 3 years. So that's 99% of the world's population who's seen that wealth gap get bigger and bigger and bigger year on year. There's got to be more than a handful of people out there who are willing to take something like WormGPT and use it to redistribute some of that wealth. There was a study done by Palo Alto a couple of months ago, on 500 CEOs, and 86% of them said they had a good understanding of cybersecurity. Now, to me, that does seem a bit lofty, and maybe our awareness campaigns and what our education is really working, but I would probably have expected to see that about 50 to 70%. But for now, let's take that 86%, which is about 430 of them, as we're really doing our job. Of those 430, only 41% of them actually admitted to having conducted a cyber risk assessment. Seems a bit odd, doesn't it, if you've got a really good understanding, but you've never conducted a cyber risk assessment on your organization. So there's definitely some legacy confidence in there, and we just need to make sure that those leaders are getting the information that they've been kept up to speed with some of these current threats and trends, because their confidence today of, I'm happy with where we are, and their confidence in 6, 12, and 24 months' time will be vastly different than it is today. And measuring AI risk is really difficult, right? So if we look at the finance and the insurance sectors, they've got centuries of data about when Tewkesbury is next going to flood in any given October. We already struggle with getting quantitative data for cybersecurity risk management. It's not that it's impossible, it's just it's not that easy to get sometimes and get some real raw figures out there. Quite often it's qualitative, it's in a nice heat map, and it gives us warm fuzzy that we're kind of prioritizing things. AI risk is new. AI is not new. AI is about 70 years old or so. And even in defensive measures, it's been around for about 15 years, machine learning and AI. But the AI that we see today, the generative AI, is relatively new. And we've not got any real metrics in order to help measure risk to inform our decision making. Okay, the Red Queens Gambit. It's a bit of an odd title, isn't it? I don't know if anybody's figured out why I went with it, and bear with me, and I hope it works. So the Red Queen famously said to Alice in Through the Looking Glass, it takes all the running you can do to keep at the same place. And it's a really interesting analogy, and it's used quite a lot across different sectors or different areas, one of them being in the animal kingdom to explain the theory of evolution. And that you kind of got to keep going to keep alive. But it's equally applicable to cybersecurity, okay? We heard earlier in the panel discussion about this AI arms race and how things are just escalating. And we've got to keep running as defenders faster and faster and faster in order to keep up with some of these fast advancing threats. The Queen's Gambit, which is the second part of it, which is the really horrible mash, is a move, and if you've seen the film about 3 years ago, you'll maybe get it, but it's a strategic move from white in the opening move of a chess game. And it's about moving the pawn in front of the queen 2 places forward. 2 reasons. One, to dominate more space on the board, and the second one is to put black's position under pressure. Okay, so taking those 2 analogies and throwing them together, we need to run faster and dominate more of our own space. This takes us into the UDA Loop. So the UDA Loop is a concept that was created by a chap called Colonel John Boyd. He was US Air Force back in the 50s. And he came up with this idea of, it was about dogfighting and how to get the better of your adversary in the aircraft opposite. And it was about observing what they were doing, orientating yourself to their actions, making a decision, and acting on that decision. The premise is that if you can close that loop faster than your adversary, then you are inside the UDA loop and you're gaining a tactical advantage. Now, I'm going to assume, in the interest of time, all the stuff at the bottom of that triangle is done. Because we definitely know everything in our environment, don't we? Come on, the nods, yeah? No? Okay. That's a challenge. So we're not dismissing the bottom. Absolutely a challenge. But here's where we start to make differences when it comes to AI threats. Inside that sort of UDA loop, you will see an AI double-headed arrow, decision-making and decision support. Handing over the keys to the kingdom to AI is dangerous if you're just going to throw it into your environment without any context and let it make decisions. We need to integrate it sooner rather than later so that we can keep pace with these evolving threats. But we've got to do that in a controlled manner. So it's about taking some of these AI tools that you're seeing possibly downstairs and at other expos, understanding where they can add to your environment, and then slowly releasing control when you know that it's making the right decisions. Once you've taken that arrow from decision support at the top down to decision making, that's when you start to really tighten the UDA loop. because you're taking all of the contextual data that you get from this trained AI and you're throwing it into that circle. But actually what you're throwing it into is decide and act. You almost get rid of all of the data that's going to the SOC analyst's eyes, and they've still got to sit and unpick that, orientate themselves and make decisions. The sooner we get ourselves down to that decision-making space, the faster we are at identifying and preventing AI-driven threats. Vulnerability management then. So this is about dominating more space of the board, understanding your environment and taking control of it. I expect that some people will have seen some of these previously. Certainly CVSS is an extremely popular one, Common Vulnerability Scoring System, and CISA's KEV, the known exploited vulnerabilities list, which is about, we're approaching 1,000, we're at 980 or something, 990, of actually witnessed in the wild vulnerabilities that have been exploited. And there's some really interesting ones which are starting to grow in popularity, like EPSS. Now, some of the problems we've got, some of the legacy, I'll call them legacy, some of the ones that have been developed in the past. So this is CVSS. There is 161,000 identified vulnerabilities that have been scored by CVSS, and that's out of 325 in total across the world and all software that exists that we know of. But you'll see in the top there, 7 and above, so anything that's high, anything that's deemed high, there's about 90,000 of them in there. And even if you get to critical, 9.0, and that should send alarm bells through any organization, about 1/10 of all vulnerabilities identified are actually in this critical bracket. But here's an interesting one. Only 5% of vulnerabilities in the world are actually exploitable, about 16,000 or so. But we've got, we've got 31,000 in that pot. So if we're basing our vulnerability management off of something like CVSS by itself, we're probably running white hot, but not really seeing any demonstrable drop in the risk to our environment. So, taking another approach then. I'm not saying CVS is bad. What I'm saying is, don't use it in isolation. This is one but many approaches that you might take in order to sort out some of the vulnerabilities in your environment and stop these cognitive threat agents getting into your space, having a look around, and trying its luck with well-known vulnerabilities. So if you, in the interest of time, we'll skip over the bottom part of this curve, the top part of the curve at the bottom there, which is 3, 2, 5, 31, and down to 2. But you can see there as you take CVSS, EPSS v3, and then ransomware likelihood. So if you're a business that's worried about ransomware, then you want to maybe use something like a ransomware likelihood filter into your process. But you can see now we're in 134 in all-time vulnerabilities, if they're the things that you're worried about. Seems a lot more manageable, doesn't it? The very bottom one then is everything that was identified in June 2023. So 1,907 vulnerabilities fresh in June. Seems quite a lot, doesn't it? And it's probably more than any business or any vulnerability management team can actually deal with. Running it through the filters, we get to 272. Stick another filter on there, and this is EPSS at 50%. Okay, EPSS says that if there's a likelihood, or if it's predicting that there's a 2% likelihood of this vulnerability being exploited in the next 30 days, you should probably do something about it. So we've been extremely cautious here, giving it 50%. That still takes us down to just 3 to look at. Now, there's a question mark at the end of ransomware likelihood there because I've got 3 to look at. Do I want to push it that far, or do I just deal with it now, or do I filter out more? So I am not saying this is the only way and the only solution to this type of problem, but if you aren't already integrating AI into your risk management strategy and you're still working through in this type of fashion, think about implementing a solution or an approach kind of like this, where it starts to reduce some of that, some of the vulnerabilities within your environment. Okay, I'm doing all right. Takeaways. The threat actors, they will continue to find unique ways in order to leverage AI to take advantage of your environment. So I implore everyone that's out there to learn and keep an ear to the ground of what's happening, some of the common threats, and the actual breaches that are happening, and maybe the sources of them. Consider these strategies. So think about how you're going to integrate AI into it in a safe way, into your environment, in a safe way, so that you know what it's doing, you know what decisions it's making, and it's making appropriate decisions based on your business's risk appetite. If it's doing something outside your risk appetite, then it's not working for you. And the last thing is staying ahead of evolving threats, and make sure that your C-suite are aware of it as well. Because like we've heard a couple of times, it's always a challenge to communicate some of those challenges. It's always a challenge to communicate some of those vulnerabilities, threats, and risks to their environment. But keeping them up to speed, but not scaremongering at the same time, is extremely important.